loved his family and loved serving this state and our country. He dedicated his life to our country.
For nearly a quarter of a century in the United States Senate, one man built a reputation on nearly everything except his personal life. He was a defense hawk, a deal-maker, a friend to presidents, and a thorn in the side of his own party more than once. But there was one question that followed him through 3 decades of campaigns, interviews, and late-night jokes on the trail. A question he always deflected with humor and never once answered with a straight face. Why did Lindsey Graham never marry? For 50 years, the country got jokes about rotating first ladies and offhand comments about bad timing. Then, within days of his sudden death at the age of 71, his only sibling, the sister he had quietly raised since she was a child, finally gave the world an answer that had nothing to do with timing and everything to do with a promise he made to an 11-year-old girl standing in a living room, terrified and orphaned, more than 50 years earlier. To understand that promise, you have to go back to a small town in upstate South Carolina, decades before anyone imagined the boy behind the bar counter would spend 30 years shaping American foreign policy from the floor of the Senate. Lindsey Olin Graham was born on July 9, 1955, in central South Carolina, a modest mill town where his parents supported the family by running a combination restaurant, pool hall, bar, and liquor store that locals simply called the Sanitary Cafe. This was not a childhood of comfort or privilege. Graham spent his early years living in cramped rooms behind the business itself, sharing a bathroom with the mill workers who came in after their shifts, heating bath water on the stove because there was no other way to get warm water in the back rooms where the family slept. It was a working-class upbringing built on long hours and thin margins, and it left an unmistakable mark on the man Graham would eventually become in Washington, a man who often referenced his blue-collar roots when explaining why he approached politics the way he did, and who rarely let his colleagues forget where he had actually come from. Even decades into a career surrounded by wealth and power, he was the first person in his family to go to college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina with the ordinary ambitions of a young man from a small town, nothing that hinted at national office or a career that would eventually place him at the center of Senate Judiciary Committee hearings, watched by the entire country. Those ordinary plans were interrupted by 2 tragedies that arrived in devastating succession. When Graham was in his early 20s, his mother Millie died of Hodgkin's lymphoma. 15 months later, his father, Florence James Graham, known to everyone as FJ, died suddenly of a heart attack. In less than 2 years, Graham went from being a college student worried about exams and part-time work to being the only adult responsible for a little sister who had just lost both of her parents before she had even reached her teenage years. There was no trust fund waiting, no extended family with the resources or structure to simply absorb a grieving child. There was only a young man not yet done with his own education, and a sister who suddenly depended on him for everything. Friends from that era have described how quickly Graham seemed to grow up once the second funeral was behind him, trading the ordinary worries of a college senior for the far heavier responsibilities of raising a child alone, largely without the support of a wide extended family network to lean on. Rather than allow his sister Darlene to be sent to live with relatives scattered around the state, Graham made the decision that would come to define the rest of his life. He kept her with him. He became, in every functional sense, her parent, taking on responsibility for her schooling, her well-being, and her stability while he was still finishing his own undergraduate degree and later attending law school at the same university. When he later enlisted in the United States Air Force and began serving as a Judge Advocate General's Corps attorney, he took the extraordinary step of legally adopting his own sister, a decision made specifically so that she could be covered under his military health and family benefits. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a practical necessity born out of love, and it made official something that had already become true in every other sense of the word. Darlene has since described her brother not as an older sibling who occasionally checked in, but as someone who became her actual parent from that point forward, filling the role of mother, father, and brother all at once. She has recalled the exact moment her father died, standing in their living room paralyzed with fear, and Graham wrapping his arms around her and promising that he would always take care of her. That promise, made by a young man barely out of his teens to a child who had just lost everything, became the axis around which the rest of his personal life quietly turned. Raising a grieving child while attending law school and beginning a military legal career that would eventually stretch across 33 years was not easy. And it did not get easier when Graham was later stationed overseas at Rhine-Main Air Base in Germany during the final years of his active duty service. Coordinating his sister's schooling and daily life from across the Atlantic Ocean required leaning on a small circle of family friends back in Central South Carolina, while Graham used every leave and furlough he could to fly home and check on her. Those who knew the family during that period have said Darlene never seemed to lack structure or attention, crediting Graham's insistence on staying involved no matter how far away his military obligations took him. Making the trip from wherever he happened to be stationed or studying back to South Carolina became a routine of its own, one that friends say he simply built into his schedule without complaint, treating it as an obligation no different from any of his official duties. That devotion did not fade as the decades passed. When Graham launched his brief campaign for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination, he and Darlene stopped together at their parents' graves in Central before the announcement, a quiet ritual that revealed more about his priorities than any stump speech that followed. The night before that announcement, Darlene reportedly walked back into the old pool room above their childhood home for the first time in roughly 30 years, a moment that left her visibly emotional as she confronted memories of the parents she barely got to know as an adult. Darlene had also appeared years earlier in one of her brother's campaign advertisements during his 2014 Senate re-election bid, telling voters directly that after their parents died, he had promised to take care of her and had simply never let her down. A promise, she said, she still could not fully explain how he managed to keep given everything else he had on his plate at the time. It was around that same period that Darlene began publicly explaining, for the first time in any detail, why her brother had never married. She told interviewers that he was simply a young man who took on the responsibility of raising a young girl and a teenager while trying to finish his own education, explaining that there was only so much time in a day and that he had dedicated all of his available time to raising her and building a foundation for both of their futures. With his sister raised and his active duty service behind him, Graham moved into elected politics, first serving as a county attorney and then as city attorney for his own hometown of Central before winning election to the South Carolina House of Representatives in 1992. From there, his career accelerated quickly. He was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1994, and in 2002, he won the Senate seat long held by Strom Thurmond, going on to win re-election multiple times over the following 2 decades, while continuing to serve in the Air Force Reserve until his retirement in 2015, closing out 33 years of total military service. In Washington, Graham became known as much for his friendships as for his votes. His bond with Senator John McCain of Arizona became one of the most talked about political friendships of the era. Alongside Senator Joe Lieberman, the two men were nicknamed the Three Amigos for their bipartisan work on defense and foreign policy, frequently traveling together to conflict zones and briefing rooms around the world. McCain often joked publicly about Graham's romantic life, noting that he had watched his friend date plenty of women over the years without ever coming close to marriage, a running joke between the two men that reporters brought up constantly and that Graham rarely tried to shut down. When McCain was diagnosed with brain cancer in 2017, it was Graham who personally delivered the news to fellow senators after speaking with him by phone, and it was Graham who remained one of the last people at McCain's side in the final stretch of his life. That friendship did not end with McCain's death in 2018. Graham helped arrange for members of the Trump family to attend McCain's funeral despite the political tension between them, a gesture that reportedly required him to personally seek permission from McCain's widow, Cindy McCain, who remained close to Graham for years afterward. Graham's legislative record reflected that same willingness to work across party lines, for better or worse depending on who was asked. He partnered with the late Senator Ted Kennedy in the mid-2000s on comprehensive immigration reform, an effort aimed at strengthening border security while creating a conditional pathway to legal status for undocumented immigrants already living in the country. The proposal drew fierce criticism from conservative activists who labeled it amnesty, a label Graham consistently rejected, arguing that enforcement and compassion were not mutually exclusive goals. Years later, he returned to the same fight as one of the Republican architects of the bipartisan Gang of Eight immigration bill in 2013, a measure that passed the Senate with bipartisan support before stalling permanently in the House. As chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2021, Graham oversaw some of the most contentious confirmation battles of the modern era, including the elevation of multiple Supreme Court justices, and he became one of the most visible defenders of the confirmation process during a period when nearly every hearing turned into a national spectacle. Supporters credited him with reshaping the federal judiciary for a generation, while critics accused him of abandoning the more moderate instincts he had shown earlier in his career. Later, beginning in 2025, he took over as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, a position he held until his death, remaining deeply involved in shaping fiscal policy debates well into what turned out to be the final year of his life. On foreign policy, Graham built a reputation as one of the Senate's most consistent national security hawks, drawing on his own background as a military lawyer to argue for a strong American presence abroad. He made repeated trips to Iraq and Afghanistan during those wars to meet with troops and diplomats firsthand, rather than relying solely on briefings back in Washington. And in later years, he became one of the loudest congressional voices supporting continued American assistance to Ukraine, traveling there multiple times and meeting directly with Ukrainian leadership, including a visit to Kyiv in the days just before his death. He was equally vocal about American support for Israel, frequently arguing that the security of both nations was directly tied to broader American interests in the region, a position that made him one of the most sought-after Republican voices whenever conflict flared up in the Middle East. His political identity shifted dramatically over the years as well. He was once one of Donald Trump's sharpest Republican critics during the 2016 primary, at one point publicly clashing with him so intensely that Trump read Graham's personal cell phone number aloud at a campaign rally. In the years following McCain's death, Graham gradually became one of Trump's closest allies in the Senate, eventually chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee and later the Senate Budget Committee, playing a central role in advancing the administration's legislative and judicial priorities during Trump's second term in office. Through every one of those chapters, one detail remained constant. Graham never married, and he never had children, a fact that trailed him through every campaign he ever ran, including his own short-lived bid for the presidency in 2016. When reporters asked who would serve as First Lady if he somehow won, Graham typically laughed the question off, once joking that he would simply rotate the role among his sister and close friends as needed. It became one of his signature bits on the campaign trail, delivered with the same easy humor he used to defuse almost every uncomfortable question thrown his way. In his own memoir, published in 2015, Graham acknowledged that marriage had simply never lined up with the rest of his life, joking that the timing was never right or that he never found the time to properly court anyone, though he did admit to once seriously considering a proposal to a woman he dated while stationed in Europe during his Air Force years, a relationship that ultimately did not lead anywhere. But underneath the jokes was a quieter truth that only became fully public after his death. Senator Lindsey Graham died on the night of July 11, 2026, at his home in Washington, D.C., following what his office initially described only as a brief and sudden illness. He was 71 years old. A preliminary examination from the District of Columbia Medical Examiner's Office later determined the cause of death to be an aortic dissection connected to arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a condition capable of developing silently for years before rupturing without warning. The timing stunned Washington. Graham had just returned from a trip to Ukraine, where he had personally met with President Volodymyr Zelensky, and he had a high-profile media appearance scheduled for the very next morning. President Trump later said he had spoken with Graham by phone the evening he died, describing him as sounding tired but otherwise like himself, unaware it would be their final conversation, and adding that police had reportedly been called to Graham's home only a short time later. Tributes arrived almost immediately from across the political spectrum, from sitting senators to foreign leaders who had worked with him on Ukraine and Middle East policy over the years. Senate Majority Leader John Thune praised him as a steady advocate for American interests abroad and a trusted colleague, while flags across the country were ordered lowered to half-staff in his memory. Members of the McCain family released their own personal statements of grief, describing Graham as someone who had remained close to them for years after John McCain's death, continuing to call and visit long after the political obligations that first connected the families had faded. Several tributes specifically noted that Graham died as the only sitting member of the Senate who had never married, a detail that had quietly followed him for his entire career and that suddenly carried far more weight once his family began speaking about what was actually behind it. It was his sister, Darlene Graham Nordun, who gave the public its fullest understanding of who her brother really was. Now a mother of two who works helping people with disabilities find employment, Darlene has spoken about her brother's decision to raise her as something he simply treated as more important than anything else in his life, including a family of his own. She has recalled that in the darkest days after their parents died, Lindsey promised her he would always take care of her, and that he spent the rest of his life quietly making good on that promise, without ever once treating it as a burden or a sacrifice. She has described him as something closer to a combination of a brother, a father, and a mother rolled into one person, someone who taught her to ride a bicycle, who showed up for the ordinary and exhausting parts of raising a grieving child, and who never let her down in the decades that followed. When directly asked, years earlier, why her brother had never married, her answer was simple and unambiguous. He had been a young man taking on the responsibility of raising a young girl and a teenager while still finishing his own education, and there had only ever been so many hours in a day. In a final, almost circular chapter to the story, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster appointed Darlene Graham Nordun to serve out the remainder of her brother's unfinished Senate term. She was sworn into office in Washington under her legal name, telling reporters afterward that her brother had always been there for her throughout her entire life, and that she intended to return the favor by finishing what he had started. It closed a circle that had begun more than 50 years earlier, in a set of small rooms behind a family bar in Central, South Carolina, when a 21-year-old college student first promised a terrified, newly orphaned little girl that no matter what it cost him, he would look after her. What Darlene's account ultimately reveals is not a hidden scandal or some secret relationship kept from public view for decades. It is something far simpler, and in its own quiet way, something far more moving. Lindsey Graham never married because, in the most literal sense possible, he had already built his family decades earlier, the moment he chose to raise his little sister instead of letting her be scattered among relatives after losing both of their parents within 15 months of each other. Every joke about a rotating first lady, every laugh line on a debate stage, sat quietly on top of that one original decision, a decision his sister only spelled out in full once the world had already lost him, and one that, in the end, says more about the man than 3 decades of Senate votes ever could.